folks, it's Heather, and this is Recently Seen Reading. I'm back for our belated Friday reads, really. We survived the hurricane pretty easily. We were without power for a couple of days, like most of the people in the province. We came through it pretty much unscathed, and we're very lucky. There were some people in the province who were without power for upwards of a week and had significant damage to property, and luckily no deaths associated with specifically the hurricane itself. So very glad to have passed through the first of hurricane season here. Undoubtedly there will be more. It's been a pretty steady reading couple of weeks for me. I did finally finish Man's Magic Mountain. It took me a long time to get through it, and I don't know that I would go back to reading it or reading another Man. I suspect I started with the wrong one and struggled with it. So I've set Thomas Mann to the side for the moment. Other than that, lots of just ordinary reading. I did jump on the hype train and finished Atwood's Testaments last week. Got it from the library. Reluctantly picked it up in some ways. Partly because I stopped reading Atwood about 10, 15 years ago, maybe even more than that. She's a very dominant voice in the Canadian literary scene, but she's also a very Ontario-focused voice, and I became pretty weary of that. A lot of chat about Canada and about the Canadian literary world kind of imagines that Canada stops at the Quebec border. And it doesn't, so I set her aside for many years. I think this is probably pretty classic Atwood in terms of lots of zippy one-liners. Testaments is a very pacey, quick read. As other folks have commented, it's got some really YA elements to it. It's interesting to read with an eye to Atwood's role in the recent controversies in Canada relating to sexual harassment. I'm not going to say much more about that. Lots of coverage in the press, and one of the parties in that situation is litigious. The thing that's interesting in Testaments is to look at the closing couple of pages in the symposium. I find it interesting and I suppose sad that Atwood's vision of what the potential future might be post-Gilead leaves kind of the gender dynamics and hierarchies of the academy in place largely, and that the vocabularies and discussions and symposiums, that all goes on as it goes on now. It's an interesting kind of rhetorical strategy, on Atwood's part. Now, it kind of undermines the rest of the novel, which suggests that change is possible. The voice of Aunt Lydia in the novel I quite enjoyed. It's very close to Atwood's own public persona, the way she speaks about things in public, so it was quite fun to read big chunks of that. But I'm not sure that I entirely bought into Aunt Lydia as self-redeeming through the process of resistance. I'm not sure that she's actually really particularly persuasive voice of resistance. So worth the time I spent reading it, yes, but not Atwood's best and not particularly deep novel, I don't think. Also read Emma Donahue's Akin, and I think that's actually a stronger novel than Atwood's. It's the story of Noel, who's a man who's about to turn 80, who has just met for the first time his grandnephew and has temporary custody of him following numerous family disasters that have disrupted everything. And he takes his 11-year-old grandnephew with him to Nice as a return to Noel, the uncle figure's birthplace. Noel left France when he was 4 in about 1943 during the occupation of France by the Germans and the Nazis. And much of the novel is taken up with working through Noel's relationship with, or Noel's, probably Noel's relationship with his mother and kind of the vernacular photographs she took, and his grandfather, who was a famous art photographer. So it, I think, is the kind of novel that would repay rereading in the way that I don't think the Testaments will repay rereading, which I think is always a measure of a stronger novel. And there's a more interesting exploration of what resistance and collaboration mean, what memory does or doesn't do for us. So in terms of the novel's strength as a whole, it's all told from Noel's point of view, and I think it might have been a slightly different novel if we had been able to get some distance from Noel. It's a little bit claustrophobic. The other thing is that the denouement of the novel rests on a pattern in contemporary fiction that I quite dislike. It rests on discovering a critical piece of information from the memory of a person who is demented, has dementia, and I find that problematic in all kinds of ways. But still, if you were looking for a recent novel by a Canadian to read, I would recommend the Donahue over the Atwood, although the Donahue's not getting much coverage, and not surprising given the amount of attention and hype to Atwood's novel. I think there are probably 2 or 3 other novels I'd like to kind of touch on today that turned out to be good reading experiences. Naomi Novik's Spinning Silver, which I think was probably all over booktube a year, 2 years ago, I found surprisingly good. I read a little bit of fantasy, not a lot. It's not my preferred reading. But this one I enjoyed, and enjoyed it more than I expected to. I was surprised by some of the ways it reworked Polish fairy tales. I mean, it's obviously reworking Rumpelstiltskin in interesting ways, but the piece that surprised me were the way it deals with pogroms and anti-Semitism. That I was totally unexpected to me. I came into the novel blind, and I think she does a good job of that. And the other thing that I quite liked is how much the novel emphasizes that cleverness is useful in the world, but how important work is. And I found that a surprising kind of take to it, so I enjoyed that and would recommend it, especially if you enjoy reading fairy tale retellings. What else was good? Oh, I did a reread of a John le Carré novel I must have read 20 years ago or more, 30 years ago even, The Little Drummer Girl, which I enjoyed. It's classic le Carré. It's got wheels within wheels, plots within plots, characters who are truthful, not truthful, deluding themselves, all the classic things from a le Carré novel. And I think it's probably in terms of the strengths of his entire canon, it's probably in excuse me. So in terms of its position in le Carré's canon and his entire body of work, it's probably a middling novel, maybe a little bit better than middling. It's unusual in that it's from a female perspective, sort of, but that's also part of the problem with it. I don't think le Carré is actually particularly good at female characters, and the female character Charlie's choices in what she chooses to do around her increasing involvement with Palestinian terrorism organizations are really kind of unmotivated in some way. She's a bit difficult to get a sense of why she does what she does. She's one of the most unclearly motivated characters in the novel, and it's interesting from that point of view. But a great le Carré read if you're looking for an espionage novel from le Carré from a slightly different perspective. And the last one I think I'd want to touch on today is another reread. I picked up Dorothy Sayers' Clouds of Witness, which is the second in her Peter Wimsey series. It was published in 1926, so it's got all the kinds of flaws that novels, and popular novels in particular from the 20s have. I mean, the kind of casual racism of the time creeps out. There's interesting things going on in it, though, around gender and sexuality and how marriages are managed or not managed, domestic violence, infidelity, all of these kinds of things, and lots of interesting things around class. And it's reminded me how much I enjoyed Sayers when I read her years ago. So I think what I might do over the course of the next year or so is just gradually reread all of her books, because I think they're probably underread now. they're one of the few books that I read and have to stop and look up words in now, and I enjoy that. The dialogue is good. It's very slangy, it's very out-of-date slang, but that's part of the pleasure in reading about Peter Wimsey and the world he lives in. I think that's it in terms of books I wanted to talk about. Just having a look at the list here. Reading coming up for me is kind of impossible in that I've gotten myself into a situation where I've got 68 books on my hold list at the library, and they're coming in more rapidly than I expected, and another ungodly amount on my already committed to reading list. So it's going to be a busy October for reading for me. Some of it just pleasure reading, and some of it read-alongs maybe, and a big chunk of it tied to my research. So I hope you've had a great week and have a fabulous reading week coming up. That's it. Bye-bye.